Right now, on a lot in Toronto, sits an electric SUV that is completely 100% legal to drive in Canada and completely being built out for a brand new lineup of Chinese cars, with the first doors opening this fall. And somewhere in a Montreal parking garage sits a car so cheap, $22,000, brand new, off the lot, that American automakers are quietly hoping their car for them. This is happening on the northern side of a border that, for cars like these, has become one of the strangest walls in the world. Here's the setup, and it's confirmed by multiple independent outlets, not just Chinese state media. In January of 2026, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's government agreed to slash its tariff on Chinese electric made EVs into the country each year, a number set to climb towards 70,000 within 5 years. That reduced tariff deal wasn't handed over for nothing either. It was negotiated in exchange for China easing its own retaliatory tariffs on Canadian agricultural exports, including canola, peas, and seafood, meaning this entire wave of new cars traces back, in part, to a trade dispute over crops grown on the Canadian prairies. The United States took the opposite path. It kept its 100% tariff fully in place and layered a national security rule on top of it, adopted in January of 2025, targeting connected car technology and navigation systems that effectively bars China-owned automakers from selling in the U.S. market, even if the cars are built on. Jameson Greer called Canada's decision problematic in a televised interview and said plainly that Canada might come to regret it. Whether or not that turns out to be true, one fact is not in dispute. Right now, the car you can walk into a Canadian dealership and buy is, in many cases, a car no American. It isn't just about tariffs, and the analogy makes it click fast. Think of North America's front doors, a Canadian door and an American door, both technically leading into the same building. For decades, both doors were locked to Chinese-made cars in roughly the same way, using similar tariffs and similar rules. Then, in 2026, Canada quietly swapped its lock for a cheaper one, while the US door stayed bolted shut, reinforced, and alarmed. Cars can now walk through the Canadian entrance with a modest 6.1% toll, while before a single Chinese-made vehicle can legally be sold there. And the biggest number in this whole story is the one that started it all. 100% versus 6.1%. That's not a small gap in trade policy. That's the difference between a car costing what it costs and a car costing twice what it costs, just for crossing a line on a map that, a few years ago, barely mattered for automobiles at all. To understand the scale of what's actually rolling into the country, look at BYD alone. The company, now the world's largest electric vehicle manufacturer by volume, has told in Canada as an initial wave, part of a broader plan reported to reach around 20 locations, starting in Toronto before expanding to Vancouver, Montreal, and Calgary. That is not a toe dipped in the water. That is a company building permanent physical infrastructure with real estate contracts and staff inside a market the United States has legally barred it from entering at all. 10 different vehicles. Dealerships fast enough to make this list feel like it's already halfway to being outdated by the time you finish watching it. Let's start the countdown, working from number 10 up to the car everyone in this story keeps coming back to. Number 10 on this list is the Dongfeng box, alongside its sibling, the Dongfeng Vigo 2. Manufacturer to physically display its vehicles on Canadian soil, showing 6 EVs at Montreal's Grand Quay and naming Quebec as its priority market. Both the box and the Vigo are being positioned under the $35,000 mark, aimed squarely at buyers who currently chose Quebec and chose to show up in person before opening a single dealership tells you something about how seriously this next wave of automakers is taking the Canadian market. Number 9 is the Chery Omoda E5, a compact electric crossover from Chery. Dealers, according to reporting from Bloomberg. That is not the pace of a company testing the waters. That's the pace of a company that had a plan sitting ready in a drawer, waiting for the door to open. Expected to land around $35,000 with roughly 414 kilometers of range. The Omoda E5 is positioned to go head-to-head with small gas-powered crossovers that dominate Canadian driveways today, not just other EVs. Because this next one isn't a press release ORA projection. It already happened. Number 8 is the JAC J5, an electric subcompact SUV from Chery's newer JAC sub-brand, and in May of 2026, 3 of them were physically spotted on the ground. A full-size Exeed Xlantic sedan and an Omoda 9 plug-in hybrid SUV. Not renderings, not concept art. Actual cars, already inside Canada, months before any formal dealership network existed. Somebody drove these off a ship and into a city most Americans will never get to see a single one of. Number 7 is the Zeekr X, a compact SUV from Zeekr, the premium electric brand owned by Geely, the same Chinese conglomerate that also owns Volvo and, as you'll hear again in a minute, Lotus. Zeekr's plan for Canada is almost sneaky in how it sidesteps building anything from scratch. Instead of constructing new dealerships, Zeekr intends to sell through existing Volvo dealer networks starting in mid-2027. Essentially inheriting decades of established Canadian trust in the Volvo badge, and quietly parking a Chinese EV brand right next to it on the showroom floor. It's worth noting, Zeekr isn't arriving as an unproven newcomer either. Inside, China's domestic market, Zeekr has scored higher than Porsche in J.D. Power's closely watched quality rankings, the kind of result that would have sounded absurd a decade ago, and now barely raises an eyebrow among people who follow the Chinese EV market closely. Number 6 is the Xpeng G6. A mid-size electric SUV from one of China's most tech-forward automakers, expected to land in Canada around $42,000 with roughly 570 kilometers of range. Xpeng has built its identity almost entirely around advanced driver assistance software, and it's currently one of the companies most often compared to Tesla inside China's domestic market, which makes its expected 2027 Canadian arrival worth watching closely. There's also a question worth sitting with here. Why are so many of these brands aiming for 2027 rather than rushing in this year? The honest answer is regulatory. Every one of these vehicles has to pass Transport Canada's safety certification process before it can legally reach a customer, covering everything from crash structure to software behind connected features, and that process simply takes time, especially for a brand with 0 prior Canadian paperwork on file. BYD has been the fastest mover specifically because it started that certification process earliest, which brings us to number 5, the NIO ET5. A sleek electric sedan built by NIO, a company known globally for a technology almost no other automaker offers, battery swapping. Instead of plugging in and waiting, NIO owners in China can pull into a swap station and have a depleted battery pack physically exchanged for a fully charged one in a few minutes, a system NIO has been quietly expanding for years. The ET5 is expected to arrive in Canada around $48,000 with a claimed range near 700 kilometers, though NIO's Canadian market entry isn't projected until late 2027, and it remains unclear whether the battery swap network will follow it across the ocean or stay a China-only feature. Let's quickly restack everything so far, because this list moves fast. We've covered the Dongfeng Box and Vigo budget models showcased in Montreal, the Chery Omoda E5, already meeting Canadian dealers within weeks of the tariff cut, the JAC J5, physically photographed on Canadian pavement months before launch, the Zeekr X, riding into Canada on Volvo's own dealer network, the Xpeng G6, a software-first SUV racing toward 2027, and the NIO ET5, carrying a battery swap technology America has never gotten to try. Now let's get into the 4 names that turn this from an interesting list into something genuinely strange. Number 4 is the Xiaomi SU7, and if that name sounds familiar, it should, because Xiaomi is the same company that makes one of the best-selling smartphones on the planet. The SU7 is a sleek electric sedan, expected in Canada around $60,000 with a claimed range near 700 kilometers. And it represents something bigger than one car. A consumer electronics giant successfully pivoting into building automobiles from the ground up, something Apple famously tried and quietly abandoned. If the SU7 performs in Canada anywhere close to how it has performed in China, it will be the clearest signal yet that the line between phone company and car company has effectively dissolved. Number 3 is where this list gets its most unusual entry. The BYD Shark 6, a plug-in hybrid pickup truck. Pickup trucks are, culturally and commercially, about as North. American as a vehicle category gets, the backbone of Ford's, GM's, and Ram's entire business models on this continent. A Chinese automaker building a pickup truck aimed at that exact segment, expected around $55,000 in Canada, is a direct statement of intent, not a side project. It says BYD isn't just interested in undercutting cheap hatchbacks. It's coming for the trucks too. Number 2 is the car that makes this entire list personal for anyone who follows British sports cars, the Lotus Eletre. Lotus is one of the most storied names in automotive history, a brand associated with lightweight, razor-sharp sports cars that raced in Formula One for decades. Today, Lotus is owned by Geely, the Chinese conglomerate, and the Eletre, its first electric SUV, is not a future promise. It is already available right now through authorized Lotus dealers in Canada, priced at roughly $119,900, making it both the most expensive vehicle on this list and the one closest to a fully finished, on-the-ground reality rather than a projection. Lotus's own CEO has said the company plans to open roughly half a dozen Canadian dealerships this year just to sell what he described as a few hundred cars, a boutique operation for a brand that clearly cares more about establishing a presence than chasing volume. There's something almost poetic about it. A badge born on British racetracks, now Chinese-owned, quietly setting up shop in Canada while its home country's biggest ally keeps the door locked. And that brings us to number 1, the car that started this entire story, and the one most likely to actually show up in large numbers on Canadian roads within the next year, the BYD Seagull. It's a small electric hatchback, and its starting price in Canada, I guess, expected to land around $22,000. That is not a typo, and it is not a stripped-down base trim designed to lure you in before upselling you to something pricier. In Quebec, after the province's Roules Verts rebate, that price could drop to roughly $20,000 out the door. For comparison, the cheapest new electric vehicles currently sold in North America, including the Nissan Leaf and the Chevrolet Equinox EV, both start well north of that number, and neither comes close on price once you account for what the Seagull is reportedly offering. Around 305 kilometers of range, a 5-star Euro NCAP safety rating across BYD's broader lineup, and BYD's own blade battery technology, a lithium iron phosphate design that has become known in the industry for passing extreme abuse testing, including a nail penetration test, without catching fire. That's not a small technical detail. Battery fires have been one of the most persistent fears holding people back from going electric at all, and BYD has spent years building its reputation specifically around solving that exact problem. Now, here's a question a lot of Canadians are quietly asking before they even think about price. Do any of these cars actually survive a real Canadian winter? This isn't a small concern in a country where parts of the population regularly deal with temperatures well below -20. BYD's blade battery, the same lithium iron phosphate design behind its nail penetration safety, results is engineered to maintain more than 80% of its capacity at -20 degrees Celsius, largely thanks to thermal management systems paired with heat pumps that come standard, not as an optional add-on, across most of the lineup. Heat pumps matter more than people realize here because they're 2 to 3 times more efficient at heating a cabin than the older resistive heating elements still found in some competing EVs, which directly translates into less range, lost to simply keeping the driver warm. Realistic estimates still point to a 20 to 25% range reduction in deep winter conditions, roughly in line with what Tesla and Hyundai owners already experience, and every one of these vehicles uses the CCS charging standard, meaning they plug into the same public charging networks already. Spread across the country, from Quebec's Circuit Electrique to FLO's pan-Canadian stations to Tesla's own supercharger network, which opened its plugs to other brands in Canada. It's worth pausing on how BYD got here in the first place, because the company's rise wasn't overnight. Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway invested roughly $230 million into BYD back in 2008, when it was still a mid-E. Sized battery and electronics manufacturer few people outside China had heard of. That stake alone has since ballooned into a position worth billions. BYD spent the years in between quietly becoming the world's largest electric vehicle manufacturer by volume, outproducing legacy giants that had a 100-year head start. The Seagull isn't a lucky one-off product. It's the output of nearly 2 decades of vertically integrated battery and manufacturing expertise, arriving in Canada at a price point that simply doesn't have a domestic or Korean equivalent to compete with it. So why does any of this actually matter beyond a list of cars? Because what's unfolding in Canada right now looks, to a lot of industry analysts, less like a one-off trade decision and more like a test run. Reporting from Bloomberg has described Chinese automakers' rapid movement into Canada as a practice run for the far larger and more heavily protected American market, a place to build service networks, gather real-world winter performance data, and prove reliability with actual Canadian owners before ever attempting to breach the American wall. Canada, meanwhile, is leaning into its position as a smaller, more flexible market willing to take risks the US currently won't, especially amid its own trade tensions with Washington. A former senior Canadian official told the Epoch Times that letting Chinese automakers build inside the US instead makes little sense from either an economic or a national security standpoint, while critics on the other side argue Canada's own auto workers are the ones actually exposed if cheap Chinese EVs flood in faster than domestic manufacturing can adapt. Both sides of that argument are being made by real people in real interviews, and neither one has been settled yet. Before going further, it's worth being completely honest about where the hard facts stop and the estimates begin, because a lot of what's floating around online right now blurs that line. Most of the pricing figures on this list, outside of the Lotus Electre and the already confirmed BYD seal, are current estimates based on international pricing and the new 6.1% tariff rate, not finalized manufacturer numbers. And several of these vehicles are still going through the Transport Canada certification process rather than sitting on dealer lots today. Nobody is claiming all 10 of these cars are available for purchase in Canada this afternoon. Some, like the JQ J5 sightings and the Dongfeng Grand K showcase, are confirmed physical on-the-ground events. Others, like the NIO and XPeng timelines stretching into late 2027, are still projections that could easily shift if certification takes longer than expected, or if trade relations between Ottawa and Washington change again in the meantime. It's also worth noting plainly that Chinese EVs sold in Canada are not eligible for the federal EVAP rebate program, which is reserved for vehicles built in Canada or in countries with existing free trade agreements, meaning the headline prices on this list, low as they already are, don't come with the extra federal incentive that domestically built EVs receive. Warranty coverage is one area where the picture is genuinely confirmed rather than estimated. BYD has committed to a 6-year, 150,000 kilometer vehicle warranty alongside an 8-year, 160,000 kilometer battery warranty, while Chery has committed to a 5-year, 100,000 kilometer comprehensive warranty, terms that Canadian regulators require every manufacturer to honor, regardless of country of origin, and that broadly match or exceed what Tesla, Hyundai, and Chevrolet currently offer on their own EVs. The gap between Canada and the US here is real and well documented. The exact shape of every individual model's Canadian launch is still, in places, a moving target, and long-term resale values for any of these. Brands in the Canadian market simply haven't existed long enough yet to measure with any real confidence. Which brings this back around to that lot in Toronto, and that price tag in Montreal, and that strange feeling of a border that, for almost every other product on Earth, barely registers, suddenly becoming one of the most consequential lines in the entire auto industry. A car that costs $22,000 sits legally parked less than a 2-hour drive from cities where the exact same car, in most cases, cannot be legally sold at all. Whether that GIP closes, widens, or simply hardens into a permanent feature of how North America buys cars, the machines themselves are already here, already certified or being certified, already sitting on ships and in showrooms, waiting for the rest of the story to catch up to them. So tell me in the comments, which one of these actually surprised you more? A $22,000 electric car legally driving around Toronto that Americans can't buy, or a legendary British sports car brand, now fully Chinese-owned, quietly opening dealerships across Canada this year. And if you want to see which one of these makes it across the border next, make sure you're subscribed, because this story is nowhere near finished.